Negative space. It doesn't sound very good. Maybe in 2021 we should be calling it differently positive space. But bad jokes aside, negative space is a good thing. It's an inevitable thing, but a good thing. Have you ever been in a situation where you think, oh wow, something cool. Oh, it's too small in the frame. It's too far away. And so you give up and you sit down and you eat your Greg's chicken bake, and then you get out your phone, you open up Instagram and think, well, that giraffe's tiny, and shiver me timbers, that raven is peculiarly insignificant. What the hell's going on? That's an understandable reaction. But the key here is negative space. So I'm going to try and cover as much of the topic as possible. What it is, how it works, how you can utilize it, and why you should learn to love it. Obviously, I'm going to come at this from a nature photography perspective, but this applies across all forms of photography and all forms of art. So let's start by trying to define negative space. And we'll use this composition I'm working on as an example. Let's say that negative space is everything that isn't the subject. So this guy is the subject, but this leaf is still in focus. This leaf over here is in focus. So what if it's not the subject, but it is in focus? Is it still negative space? And what if I want to take a wider shot, show in the image that this flower is on the side of a nice country path? And then if I walk into the image to give context, and I'm standing on the path, do I now become positive space, even though I'm out of focus? So I like to think of negative space as anything which isn't the subject. I think this way because I often use negative space to add context to an image to help tell a story. It's very rare that any of my images will have truly negative space. It can be a really cool effect. I'll show some of my images which do have truly negative space. That's space in the picture which has no detail at all. It's saying don't bother looking here. There's nothing to see. Okay, so whilst I film these two grebes, let's talk about why earlier I said that negative space was a good thing. Well, let's look at the alternatives. There's bad negative space, which is why I think a lot of beginners avoid negative space and they go straight for the subject. Because if the negative space is bad, it really brings down the overall niceness of an image, regardless of how good the subject was captured. The other alternative is to try and eliminate the negative space. Take this first image of a squirrel, for example. You might look at the negative space and say, well, it's crap, it doesn't do anything, it's not needed. Let's get rid of it. So you move in closer. But now what you've done is you've made the subject too cramped, which generally doesn't make for good viewing. So you go in even further, and now what you've done is change the subject. You've gone from the subject being the squirrel to now the subject maybe being the eye. And now that subject is only a small part of the frame and it's surrounded by negative space again. So why is negative space good? Because it's inevitable, so you have to make it good. And that brings us nicely onto how to utilize negative space. What techniques can we use to realize the image that we're after? Now the sun's just gone down, but I'm going to talk you through what I was just shooting because it's such a common case in wildlife photography. The point of the negative space here was just to give the subject room to breathe. So we're not cropped in too tightly, we want to give it space, and we want that space to be smooth and not distracting. And to do that, I'm going to use a shallow depth of field and I'm going to get down to eye level with the subject. By doing both of those things, I ended up with this shot. Ooh, well, the sun's been down about 20 minutes now, and it's often worth sticking around for a bit longer after the sun sets because the colours can really do something special. But this shot here is pretty much the opposite of what I was shooting over there earlier with the birds. It's very intentional negative space. And it's my favourite type of negative space to look at in other people's pictures, but it's often the hardest to capture because it's rare that you come across a scene that's so minimal that you can have a huge amount of space around your subject and for stuff in that space not to get distracting. So in this scene, I've got the sea down the bottom and I've got a lot of sky above, and it fades out from the very warm strip at the sunset. It fades up to the blue, which will obviously eventually go black, but I'm not going to stick around for that. I'm going to take a series of pictures here. I'm going to use a technique which I have already made a video about. I'm going to fire off about 20 frames to blend together to create a long exposure for the water. If you're interested in that, the video will pop up in one of the corners. Okay, so this one is intentional, artistic negative space, extreme negative space. And this is what the image looks like. Another type of negative space is contextual space. With video, it's very easy to tell a story. You can pan the camera, you can cut to another frame, but with photography, you've only got one frame, and so the elements that you place inside the scene are really important to telling the story. And so I'm choosing to compose this image with more context. Usually with wildlife, you tend to shoot with a long lens, and that would create a nice portrait of the subject, but by coming out wider and using the 70 to 200, I can add elements into the background. The multiple layers of hills off into the background, a couple of peaks, there's a couple of woodlands in the background, and there's this dappled light from the broken cloud that we've got today. And all of that creates a dynamic picture, but it creates an interesting picture because it gives context. It tells you where this pony is living. It shows you the landscape. So I'm shooting at 200mm at f2.8, waiting for the light to be just right. And there's the picture. So whilst we're up here on Dartmoor with the ponies, I'm going to use them to recreate another shot which I've done in the past. And the negative space in this shot can only really be described as graphic negative space, because I've got a large area of white space and then a large area of shaded ground once the clouds come back over. You've got a lot of contrast there. And so it's similar in a way to the extreme negative space from earlier in the video, but it's even more simple because in post I'm going to pull the shaded ground right down to black, and I'm going to take the white sky and the white clouds right up to white. And so you've got nothing but truly negative space and truly positive space. And it makes for a really cool image. I think that's all the images I'm going to take for this little exploration into negative space. But the takeaway shouldn't be my loose interpretations of what different types of negative space can be. The takeaway should be the realization that negative space is there in your image, and a little bit of thought into how to use the negative space can have a very large influential impact on how your subject is viewed. Hopefully this has been interesting and helpful, and I'd appreciate any likes and comments in the section below. Maybe if you've got other ways which you like to use negative space and you'd like to let other people know, because this was definitely not an exhaustive list of things you can do with negative space. Other than that, feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, and I'll catch you next time.